November 4th, 1944. Peleliu Island. The Pacific sun is a dull orange blade cutting through the thick, humid mist of the Umurbrogel mountain. On this hellish rock, the ground isn't dirt. It is razor-sharp, ancient coral that shreds boots and skin with equal indifference. Every Marine on this island is fighting for every bloody, sweat-soaked inch of ground. But on the crest of Hill 326, something impossible is happening. Private First Class Thomas Elijah Watson, a 22-year-old kid from the deep, coal-dusted hills of Kentucky, is lying perfectly still in a natural crevice of jagged white stone. His finger is steady on the trigger of an M1903 Springfield rifle, but there is something fundamentally wrong with the weapon, something that would make a conventional officer laugh and a drill instructor scream in disbelief. Watson isn't using a sophisticated high-tech flash hider or some experimental military prototype. Instead, he reaches into his pack, pulls out a standard-issue olive-drab wool sock, and slowly, deliberately, slides it over the muzzle of his 4-power inertial scope-equipped rifle. To any outsider, it looks like a moment of absolute madness, perhaps a mental breakdown born of combat fatigue. But to the elite Japanese garrison entrenched 500 yards across the valley, it is the start of a clinical nightmare they will never see coming. Inside their fortified caves, Japanese officers are studying tactical maps, certain that their positions are invisible and their deep defenses are impenetrable. They are dead wrong. They are being hunted by a man who understands that in the jungle, the only thing more valuable than firepower is total, absolute invisibility. For the next 12 agonizing hours, that single piece of 25-cent military hosiery will rewrite the tactical manual on concealment forever. By the time the sun finally sinks below the horizon on this bloody day, Watson will have personally accounted for 29 confirmed kills, 29 enemy soldiers, systematically erased from the battlefield without a single round of return fire ever coming his way. Not a single Japanese soldier will be able to confirm his existence. Not a single observer will spot the telltale muzzle flash in the shadows. Not a single scout will detect the dust cloud that usually betrays a sniper's location with every single pull of the trigger. The Japanese military doctrine emphasized aggressive, screaming assaults and close-quarters combat, but they had no answer for an enemy they could not find. They were being picked off by an invisible ghost they could not engage, and could not even prove was actually there until their senior officers simply stopped reporting for duty. This isn't just a story about a lucky day on the firing range. This is a forensic breakdown of the legendary Watson sock trick, a moment where raw American ingenuity met old-world Appalachian hunting instincts to create the deadliest single-day threat the Japanese forces had encountered in the entire Palau campaign. It is a story that proves that in the absolute chaos of industrial high-tech warfare, sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't a billion-dollar machine. It is a piece of simple cotton fabric, a patient mind, and the cold, hard realization that the man you can't see is the man who will kill you first. One Marine, one rifle, one sock, and a record of silence that has stood for over 80 years. This is how the ghost of Hill 326 paralyzed a fortress and changed the face of sniper warfare forever. If you want to know the real secret to absolute concealment, listen closely. This is how the final legend was truly born. Thomas Elijah Watson didn't find his calling in a military manual or a pristine classroom. He found it in the deep, coal-shadowed hollows of Appalachia, Kentucky. In a world where the margin for survival was measured by the daily weight of a hunting bag, marksmanship wasn't a hobby. It was a survival skill as fundamental as breathing. Growing up with 7 hungry siblings and a father whose lungs were black from the coal mines, Watson learned early that every cartridge had a price, and every miss meant a night without dinner. By 12 years old, he was a ghost in the hardwoods, moving through the underbrush with a predatory silence that would later become his trademark. He wasn't just shooting, he was learning the delicate language of the forest, the way a squirrel's tail flickered, or the way the wind moved the canopy. By the time he was 15, local hunters had stopped betting against him. He could consistently ring a steel plate at 300 yards using nothing but basic iron sights, a feat that defied the mechanical limitations of his worn-out rifle. The Appalachian Hills were his first training ground, and necessity was his most ruthless instructor. When the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor crackled over the radio on December 7, 1941, the mood in his small town shifted from quiet poverty to a grim, collective determination. Watson didn't wait for the draft to find him. On December 8th, the very next morning, he walked into the Marine Corps recruitment office with his father's blessing and a lifetime of lethal instincts. He was 21 years old, a quiet kid with eyes that seemed to have already seen everything the world could throw at him. When he arrived at the Marine Corps recruit depot on Parris Island, he was just another face in a sea of olive drab. But that changed the moment he stepped onto the rifle range. The drill instructors, men hardened by years of service and professional skepticism, watched in stunned silence as Watson operated at a proficiency that was practically unprecedented. During his long-range qualification at 500 yards, Watson remained as still as a mountain ridge. As the heavy Springfield bucked against his shoulder, he placed 48 out of 50 shots directly into the inner ring of the target, a performance that broke records and sent a ripple through the command structure. Rangemaster Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Holbrook personally flagged Watson's records for immediate sniper consideration. Holbrook saw something in Watson that went beyond skill. He saw a terrifying, unshakable calm, the kind of focus that couldn't be taught. It could only be born. By March of 1942, Watson was fast-tracked to the Scout Sniper School at Camp Matthews near San Diego. This was the birthplace of the modern Marine sniper, a place where the woodsmanship of the frontier met the clinical science of the optical scope. The curriculum was a brutal gauntlet designed to break the weak, range estimation using nothing but the naked eye, advanced camouflage techniques that required disappearing into a barren landscape, and the painstaking art of long-term observation. Watson excelled in every category, but while his peers were perfecting their holdovers for 800-yard shots, Watson became obsessed with a different, far more terminal problem: the signature. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that in the high-intensity jungle warfare of the Pacific, the muzzle of a rifle was a lethal liability. He studied the three components of the sniper's death sentence with a forensic intensity. First, there was the primary muzzle flash, the blinding spike of burning powder gases that turned the shooter into a beacon in the low-light environment of the jungle floor. Second, there was the dust signature, the violent shockwave that slammed into the ground and kicked up a visible cloud of debris with every shot. Third, there was the heat shimmer, the thermal distortion that rose from a hot barrel and blurred the target through the 8-power unertl scope. Watson knew that the German snipers on the Eastern Front used bulky flash suppressors that added weight and ruined the barrel's natural harmonics, and the Soviet snipers relied on pre-selected terrain that wasn't always available in the chaotic, shifting front lines of the Pacific. He realized that the moment he pulled the trigger, he was inviting the entire Japanese army to find him. He needed a solution that was light, improvised, and effective, a way to kill without a trace. The breakthrough finally arrived in June of 1942, during a grueling training exercise in the sandy, sun-scorched terrain of Southern California. Watson had spent hours crawling into a near-perfect position, invisible to the naked eye. He fired 3 shots, each one a direct hit on a distant target. But Captain Robert McLaughlin, the school's lead instructor, walked directly to Watson's position within seconds. "Your camouflage was perfect, Watson," McLaughlin said, "but your rifle told me exactly where you were. That dust cloud just killed you and your spotter." Frustrated by the mechanical limitations of his weapon, Watson retreated to his gear. He stared at his pack, his mind working through the physics of the blast. He saw a pair of standard-issue olive-drab wool socks. In a moment of pure, desperate inspiration, he pulled a sock over the muzzle of his Springfield. He realized that the fabric could act as a crude, improvised diffuser, trapping the powder gases and slowing the pressure wave before it could hit the ground. He adjusted his scope, took aim, and fired. The result was a dramatic shift in the mathematics of concealment. The sock didn't just dampen the flash, it changed the very nature of the rifle's signature. The legend of the ghost was no longer a theory. It was about to become a terrifying reality for the Japanese Empire. The Southern California sun was a relentless, punishing weight on the shoulders of every Marine at Camp Matthews. But for Thomas Watson, the blistering heat was secondary to a growing, gnawing sense of failure that felt far heavier than his combat gear. He was a master of the rifle, a kid who had learned to hit a moving squirrel in the thick, dark Appalachian timber before he could properly read a map or drive a car. Yet here, in the clinical, unforgiving environment of the Scout Sniper School, he was being killed over and over again by the seasoned instructors. It wasn't a lack of accuracy that was failing him. His groups were tight, his breathing was disciplined, and his trigger pull was as smooth as mountain water running over stones. He was being betrayed by the very laws of physics that governed his weapon. Captain Robert McLaughlin, a man whose eyes were as sharp and unforgiving as the jagged shards of a broken whiskey bottle, stood only 10 yards away, his arms folded across his chest in a posture of professional disappointment that spoke louder than any reprimand. "You're dead again, Watson," McLaughlin barked, his voice cutting through the dry, shimmering desert air like a razor-edged whip. "I didn't need to see your face through my binoculars. I didn't even need to see the distinctive silhouette of your rifle barrel against the scrub. I just sat here and watched that 3-foot-wide cloud of fine dust you kicked up the second you pulled the trigger. In the Pacific jungles, that's not just a signature. It's a neon sign for every Nambu machine gun and knee mortar in a 1,000-yard radius. You might be the best shot in Kentucky, son, but right now, you're just a very loud, very visible corpse." Watson lay there in the prone position, his face pressed into the hot, unforgiving sand, feeling the sting of the grit against his skin and the much sharper sting of the captain's tactical critique. He knew McLaughlin was right. The M1903 Springfield was a masterpiece of bolt-action engineering, but its muzzle was a violent, high-velocity eruptor of high-pressure gases. When the firing pin struck the primer and ignited the powder, the resulting explosion created a massive shockwave that exited the barrel at supersonic speeds. In a dry environment like this, or on the dusty volcanic ridges of a Pacific island, that shockwave slammed into the earth and announced the shooter's presence with a miniature, localized sandstorm. Watson crawled back to his gear, his mind racing through the mechanical and ballistic variables of the problem with the focus of a clockmaker. He needed a baffle. He needed a way to slow down the exit velocity of those gases and disrupt the pressure wave without destroying the gyroscopically stabilized flight path of the .30 caliber bullet. He reached into his rucksack, searching for a tool, and his hand closed around a spare olive-drab wool military sock. It was a crude, dirty, unremarkable piece of clothing, but as he pulled it out and stared at the tight, overlapping weave of the fabric, a theory of fluid dynamics began to take shape in his mind. He pulled the sock over the muzzle of his Springfield, securing it tightly with a piece of twine, and crawled back into his firing position. "What the hell are you doing, Watson? You trying to keep your gun warm for the winter?" a fellow recruit whispered from a nearby foxhole. Watson didn't answer. He adjusted the dials on his 8-power inertial scope, felt the familiar weight of the rifle against his shoulder, breathed out exactly half a lungful of air, and squeezed the trigger. The results were instantaneous, visceral, and nothing short of revolutionary. Instead of the sharp, focused jet of flame and expanding gas that usually hammered the ground into a cloud of dust, the muzzle blast was captured, held, and then gently diffused. The porous, multi-layered nature of the wool fabric acted as an improvised, multi-stage expansion chamber. As the high-pressure gases exited the muzzle, they didn't hit the open air as a single, concentrated force. Instead, they slammed into the thousands of individual, interlocking fibers of the sock. The fabric acted as a chaotic physical barrier that absorbed a significant portion of the kinetic energy and forced the gases to scatter in 1,000 different directions simultaneously. The signature wasn't gone, but it had been fundamentally transformed from a violent, detectable spike into a soft, multi-directional whisper of air. The dust on the ground beneath the barrel barely shivered. Most importantly, the bright orange-white muzzle flash that usually accompanied a high-velocity shot, a beacon in the low light of a jungle canopy, was trapped and extinguished within the dense fibers of the wool. The heat of the burning powder was absorbed by the natural lanolin and the slight dampness of the fabric, preventing the thermal bloom that would normally betray an enemy observer using high-end optical equipment. Watson fired a second time, then a third. McLaughlin, who had been watching the ridgeline through his own high-powered optics, felt a professional chill that had nothing to do with the shifting desert wind. Even though he knew exactly where Watson was lying, the instructor found himself unable to pinpoint the exact location of the muzzle. There were no dust clouds blooming like gray flowers in the dirt. There were no sharp, artificial flares of light. There was only the rhythmic, metallic clank of the Springfield's bolt and the distant, satisfying ring of lead hitting steel as Watson's bullets found their mark with unerring precision. McLaughlin walked over to Watson's position, his expression shifting from skeptical irritation to a profound, quiet respect. He reached down and touched the wool sock, which was now warm to the touch and smelling of burnt cordite and damp earth. "Unconventional, Watson," McLaughlin whispered, almost to himself, his voice devoid of its usual bark, "but damn near perfect." He realized in that moment that he wasn't looking at a piece of laundry. He was looking at a tactical evolution. This was the moment the Watson sock method transitioned from a desperate field-expedient improvisation into a recognized military doctrine. The subsequent after-action report sent to the Marine Corps Training Command was clinical, dense, and stunning in its implications. It detailed the complex physics of signature reduction, how the irregular, fuzzy surface of the fabric broke up the distinctive straight-line silhouette of the rifle barrel, allowing it to blend seamlessly into the chaotic, fractal patterns of the natural world. It explained how the moisture trapped in the wool fibers acted as a high-efficiency heat sink, dramatically reducing the heat shimmer that often blurred a sniper's field of view through his scope after repeated firing. The report concluded with a recommendation that would eventually alter the sniper curriculum at Camp Matthews and beyond. Private Watson has demonstrated that in the arena of modern concealment, the most effective tools are often the ones found in a soldier's own pack. He has proven that signature management is not a product of expensive, factory-produced machinery, but of creative, individual adaptation. Recommend immediate evaluation and wider field implementation of this technique for all Scout sniper units. As Watson eventually packed his gear for deployment to the Pacific Theater, he didn't just carry extra ammunition and dry rations. He carried a dozen extra pairs of dark wool socks. He understood with the cold clarity of a hunter that in the coming months, in the dark, suffocating, and terrifying jungles of Guadalcanal, those simple pieces of cloth would be the thin line between a successful mission and a shallow, forgotten grave. The mathematics of survival in the Pacific had been rewritten on a dusty range in California, and the variable that changed the entire equation was a piece of common wool that cost the government less than a nickel. The ghost of Hill 326 was finally ready to hunt, and for the first time in the history of the war, the sniper was truly, terrifyingly invisible. The transition from the sun-bleached, open-air ranges of Southern California to the suffocating emerald claustrophobia of Guadalcanal in September of 1942 was more than just a change in geography. It was a descent into a primeval theater of war where the laws of physics were rewritten in blood, mud, and absolute silence. Thomas Watson arrived on the island as part of the 1st Marine Division, carrying a Springfield rifle that had been transformed from a standard infantry weapon into a ghost-making machine. But the dense, humid reality of the Solomon Islands presented challenges that no training manual could have fully anticipated. In the jungle, visibility was a luxury, rarely exceeding 100 yards through the tangled, light-starved undergrowth. The traditional, long-range marksmanship Watson had perfected at 500 yards was almost impossible, replaced by a much more intimate and terrifying form of combat. He realized instantly that his sock trick was no longer just an advantage, it was his primary means of survival. On September 23, 1942, Watson recorded his first confirmed combat kill, a moment that proved the technical validity of his improvisation under fire. A Japanese officer, positioned approximately 200 yards away, was attempting to coordinate a heavy machine gun section against the thin marine perimeter. Watson was deeply entrenched in a thicket of ferns, his rifle muzzle wrapped in a dark, dampened wool sock that blended perfectly into the damp shadows. When the trigger broke, there was no sharp crack to echo through the valley, and no telltale puff of white smoke to betray his position. The officer dropped instantly, and the Japanese machine gun crew, unable to locate the source of the fire, panicked and abandoned their position. For 4 months on Guadalcanal, Watson accumulated 17 confirmed kills, but more importantly, he treated the island as a lethal laboratory, perfecting a methodology that would eventually save dozens of American lives. He discovered that the light-colored wool socks provided by the quartermaster were a liability in the deep shadows, acting as a pale beacon that caught the flickering light of the canopy. He began a methodical search for dark alternatives, eventually settling on navy blue or black wool that absorbed rather than reflected the ambient light. He realized that the moisture content of the fabric was the critical variable in the signature equation. A dry sock was a fire hazard, a collection of dry fibers waiting to ignite under the 2,000-degree heat of the muzzle blast. By dampening the fabric with water from his canteen, he created a natural heat sink that slowed the degradation of the fibers and suppressed the thermal bloom that would otherwise betray his position. He learned the hard way that the sock had to be replaced after exactly 5 to 7 shots. Beyond that threshold, the accumulation of unburned powder residue would turn the fabric into a combustible wick, creating the very flash signature he was trying to eliminate. By February of 1943, Watson had codified a complete system: use dark wool, keep it damp, rotate the fabric every 5 rounds, and carry at least a dozen spares for a full-day mission. This wasn't just folklore, it was forensic tactical science. The Marine Corps took notice, and in an unprecedented move, the March 1943 update to the Scout Sniper Instruction Manual included Watson's technique in an official appendix. It was the first time in history that a field improvisation from an enlisted Marine had been integrated into the highest level of sniper doctrine. By the time Watson deployed for his second major campaign at Cape Gloucester in December of 1943, he was no longer just a sniper. He was a legend in the making. The terrain of Cape Gloucester was a nightmare of constant, torrential rain and rotting rainforest, a place where everything was perpetually wet, including the rifles. Paradoxically, Watson found that the constant moisture made his sock technique even more effective. The wet wool never dried out, and the waterlogged fibers provided an even denser barrier for the muzzle gases. Over 17 days of operations, he recorded 23 confirmed kills. The Japanese, who had been trained to look for muzzle flashes as their primary method for counter-sniper fire, were completely paralyzed. A captured intelligence report from the Japanese 65th Brigade, later translated by Naval Intelligence, noted with growing alarm that the Americans were employing snipers of exceptional concealment capability. The report stated that standard counter procedures were failing because the shooters were unseen, creating a significant and terminal impact on troop morale. By the time September of 1944 rolled around, Watson had participated in 4 major campaigns, and his confirmed kill count stood at 63. But the true measure of his impact was the spread of his technique. Other Marine sniper platoons were now issuing extra wool socks as standard-issue sniper equipment. The Japanese forces were developing a deep, psychological fear of any area where a sniper might be operating, a tactical advantage that psychological warfare analysts recognized as being as valuable as any artillery barrage. Watson had transformed the Springfield rifle from a loud, obvious weapon of the past into a silent, spectral executioner of the future. He spent hours in his foxhole at night, cleaning the 4-power Unertl scope with a precision that bordered on religious devotion, knowing that even a single smudge of jungle mold could turn his optics into a blurred, useless tube of glass. His spotter, Corporal James Martinez, watched this process with a quiet, professional admiration. Martinez, a man from the sun-baked plains of Texas, had seen many marksmen, but he had never seen anyone as obsessed with signature management as Watson. They would sit in the darkness, the air thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and mosquito repellent, and discuss the nuances of windage and elevation, always returning to the critical importance of the sock. Watson would explain that the fabric acted like a primitive muffler, not just for the light but for the sharp, high-frequency sound of the muzzle blast that was so distinctive in the still, damp air of the rainforest. By December of 1943, the Watson method had become a rite of passage for new snipers entering the theater. They were taught to respect the wool, to treat it with the same care they gave their ammunition. The captured Japanese diaries from Cape Gloucester told a story of a garrison that felt it was being hunted by spirits, by a malevolent force that struck from the shadows and left no trace behind. One entry, written by a Japanese corporal, described the terror of seeing his sergeant's head explode while they were both deep within the cover of a banyan tree, with no sound and no flash to indicate where the death had come from. This was the psychological leverage Watson had built, a weapon of pure, unadulterated terror that would soon be unleashed with full force upon the defenders of Peleliu. He had the gear, he had the experience, and most importantly, he had a pack full of navy blue socks. The Japanese thought they were ready for the Marines, but they weren't ready for the Ghost. They didn't know that the deadliest weapon on the island was a kid from Kentucky and a piece of wool that cost less than a nickel. The mathematics of death were about to reach their terminal conclusion on Hill 326, where one man would prove that in the absolute darkness of war, the most dangerous enemy is the one you cannot find. By the early days of November 1944, the island of Peleliu had ceased to be a tactical objective and had become an apocalyptic landscape of shattered coral and unyielding endurance. The High Command's optimistic prediction of a 4-day victory had long since dissolved into a grueling, yard-by-yard battle of attrition against the most sophisticated defensive network the American military had ever encountered in the Pacific. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had abandoned the traditional doctrine of beach defense, instead retreating his 10,000-man garrison into the Umerbrogol Mountains, a labyrinth of 500 interconnected caves and jagged ridges that the Marines had rightfully christened Bloody Nose Ridge. Hill 326 was the keystone of this fortress, a jagged outcropping that provided the Japanese with a god's-eye view of every American supply route and landing zone. Standard infantry assaults had been shredded by interlocking fields of fire, and even the heaviest naval bombardments seemed to bounce harmlessly off the reinforced limestone. The division commander needed a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, and that scalpel was Thomas Elijah Watson. During the moonless darkness of November 3rd, Watson and his spotter, Corporal James Martinez, began their silent ascent. They didn't move like soldiers. They moved like shadows, navigating the razor-sharp coral crevices with a calculated, predatory slowness that defied the exhaustion of the campaign. They selected a hide approximately 580 yards from the primary Japanese positions, a natural limestone fold that offered a narrow, protected corridor of fire while masking their physical profiles from any counter-observation. As the first gray light of November 4th began to bleed across the Pacific horizon, Watson performed his ritual. He pulled a fresh navy blue wool sock from his pack, dampened it slightly with water from his canteen, and slid it over the muzzle of his Springfield. Through the long 8-power inertial scope, the world of Hill 326 became a clinical, two-dimensional plane of targets and trajectories. Martinez, lying just inches away, whispered the data through his binoculars. Windage, 3 minutes left. Elevation, 2 degrees down. Range, 580 yards. The first target appeared at 0607 hours, a Japanese junior officer emerging from a cave to scan the American lines. Watson didn't rush. He watched the man's breathing, waited for the pause, and then squeezed the trigger. The Springfield's bolt jumped back with a suppressed, muffled thud. There was no flash. There was no dust. Through the lens, Watson saw the officer simply collapse into the coral dust. To the surrounding Japanese soldiers, it looked as if the man had suffered a stroke or had been struck by a piece of falling rock. No one looked toward the ridge. No one fired back. For the next 3 hours, the silence of the sock trick held the Japanese in a state of lethal ignorance. Watson remained nearly motionless, his body aching from the unforgiving coral, his mind locked into a state of hyper-focused patience. Every shot was a mathematical exercise in fluid dynamics and atmospheric correction. He fired 4 shots from his first sock, each one resulting in a confirmed kill on an observer or a machine gun commander. At 0905, he carefully rotated the fabric, replacing it with a fresh, damp sock to avoid the risk of powder ignition. The environment on the hill was now what Martinez called a target-rich landscape. Japanese activity was peaking, yet their command structure was being systematically dismantled by a ghost. The climax of the mission arrived at 11:30 hours. A group of high-ranking Japanese personnel, led by a senior officer with an elaborate silk-wrapped katana, gathered near a central cave entrance to examine maps. It was a command conference in the open air, a rare moment of tactical vulnerability. Watson's heart rate didn't spike, it slowed. He took aim at the senior officer and fired. The man fell instantly. In the 20 seconds of pure, focused chaos that followed, Watson worked the Springfield's bolt with mechanical perfection. 4 more shots, 4 more hits, 3 more officers and a senior non-commissioned officer were erased before they could even identify the direction of the threat. The Japanese scattered, diving for the cover of caves they had already been ranged for, but the damage was irreversible. By 1300 hours, Watson was on his 4th sock and 19th confirmed kill. The Japanese on Hill 326 were no longer a cohesive fighting force. They were a group of terrified individuals, hiding in the dark, convinced that the Americans had developed a silent, invisible weapon. Watson continued to fire throughout the afternoon, adding 6 more kills including a signalman attempting to use a mirror to reflect the sun. The final 29th kill occurred at 1742 hours as the light began to fail. A lone officer emerged, perhaps in a final attempt to rally his shattered unit. Watson compensated for the low light distortion, felt the trigger break, and watched the man fall through the grainy circle of his optics. As darkness finally reclaimed the island, Watson and Martinez didn't move. They waited for the required 6 hours of extraction silence, lying still in the cold coral, surrounded by the ghosts of a brigade they had destroyed with nothing more than a rifle, 29 rounds, and 6 wool socks. The fortress of Hill 326 had been neutralized without a single American infantryman having to set foot on the slope, and as they finally slipped away into the night, they left behind a field of dead who would never understand the simple Appalachian trick that had cost them their lives. The sun finally rose over a neutralized Hill 326 on the morning of November 5th, revealing a tactical silence that was as profound as it was eerie. When the Marine infantry finally ascended the slopes that had previously been a meat grinder of Japanese fire, they didn't find a desperate last stand. Instead, they found abandoned cave entrances and the bodies of the leadership that had once held the fortress together. Many of those officers had fallen exactly where they stood, victims of a ghost they never heard and a muzzle flash they never saw. The silence was absolute, a testament to a mission that had achieved total tactical paralysis without a single American casualty on that ridge. The battle for Peleliu would continue for weeks, but the back of the resistance on the Umabrogal had been broken by one man with a single bolt-action rifle and a handful of wool socks. Thomas Watson's achievement was so statistically anomalous and tactically significant that it could not be ignored by the higher echelons of the Marine Corps. By early 1945, the Watson method was no longer just a field rumor shared between seasoned scouts. It was the official standard for signature reduction, explicitly credited in the training manuals to the private first class who had the common sense to use what was in his pack. It was taught to every scout sniper through the freezing, wind-swept mountains of the Korean War and the steam-choked, claustrophobic jungles of Vietnam. Legendary snipers like Carlos Hathcock would later cite Watson's ingenuity as a foundational inspiration, proving that the most effective tools aren't always the most expensive or the most complex. Watson himself survived the meat grinder of the Pacific Theater, eventually rotating back to the United States in February of 1945 after a mortar attack on Okinawa finally caught up with him. He came home with the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, and 2 Purple Hearts, decorations that usually belong to officers of high rank, yet they sat quietly in a drawer in a modest house in Kentucky. He returned to the rolling hills of his youth, married in 1947, and spent 34 years working for the United States Post Office. He never wrote a memoir, he never signed a movie deal, and he rarely spoke of the 153 confirmed souls he had taken from the world. When he was finally invited to Quantico in 1976 to speak to the graduating class of the Scout Sniper School, his message was as simple as his technique. He told those young Marines that being a sniper wasn't about being a killer. It was about being a provider, providing safety for the men on the ground by being the invisible shield that the enemy could never find. He died in 1994, but his legacy lives on in the climate-controlled glass of the Marine Corps Museum at Quantico, where a single stained navy blue wool sock sits as a testament to American resourcefulness. It is a reminder that in an age of billion-dollar satellite arrays and integrated suppressors, the most powerful weapon in the world is still a human mind that refuses to accept the limitations of its equipment. Thomas Watson proved that innovation doesn't require a laboratory. It only requires a problem and the will to solve it. Keep the history alive, and remember the lessons of Hill 326. Would you trust your life to a simple wool sock in the heat of battle? Or do you believe technology is the only path to victory? Let us know in the comments below. What other untold stories of battlefield ingenuity should we explore next? Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten legends to light. Subscribe to Tales of Valor for more detailed accounts of the individuals who changed the face of war through raw, unadulterated grit. We will see you in the next chapter of human history. God bless you.